Today we have the newest, most up-to-date 2-liter diesel engine from BMW, the B47, and it will remain relevant for decades to come. There is very little information about it on the internet, but we've taken the time to analyze and search for it, so I think this will be interesting. Give us likes, grab some popcorn, and let's get started. Now, as you know, we really love making videos about BMW engines, and we're continuing our series on diesel engines. Right now, we're at Petrivka at our third station in Kyiv. We mentioned in previous videos that we reopened this service center during the war. Right now, we're shooting a video and have found such an example for you. This is a G30 520D with the B47 engine. I think you've already watched our previous video about this engine's predecessor, the N47. Check it out. It's got a decent number of views, and it turned out to be a big and informative video. Now we found another interesting example for you, a G-Series G30 520D with the B47 engine, and we're going to tell you about it. It's symbolic, by the way. Last time we had the F10 520D with the N47 engine, and now we've got the G30 520D with the B47 engine. No more F30, I'm already happy. The B47 started production in 2014 and gradually replaced the N47. We talked in our videos about how the N47 was produced until 2016-2017, and then the B47 started replacing it on popular models like the F10 or F25. Look, if you have a 2017 F10, or even from 2016 or 2015, it will already have the B47 engine. The same goes for the F25. For example, on our favorite F30, specifically the 320D. The B47 started being installed with the facelift in the second half of 2015. If you calculate the production time, the B47 has already been in production for around 8 years. Its predecessor, the N47, was also produced for a long time, and, as you remember, it had many different modifications. I analyzed the situation with the B47 and found that while there are many modifications, there are 3 main ones that we'll focus on. The first modification isn't the primary one. It's the front-wheel drive versions that were installed on Minis, the X1 and X2, like the X1, F48 and X2, meaning those with the transverse engine layout. Since we have a lot of BMW service centers across Ukraine and many clients, we understand the demand for body types and engines. The most popular version of the B47 for us is the one installed on the 5 Series, X3, F30, 4 Series, 1 Series, and 2 Series. This version was even installed on the G series, such as the G30, for example, and on the G01, which is the X3, and the G02, which is the X4 in the G series. These versions were produced until around mid-2018. This applies to models like the G30 and G01. They came with a single turbo. At the same time, there were versions with 2 turbos. This is the second main modification. These versions were found, for example, on the F30 325D, the 225D from the 2 Series, the 425D from the 4 Series, and even the 525D from the G30. These are twin-turbo versions. The engine itself is basically the same as the 2-liter from the first version, but here we have a modified 2-stage turbocharging system with 2 turbos. The first version had 190 horsepower, and if we compare it to the N47, which had 184 horsepower, the B47 here gives us 190 horsepower. In the 525D version, for instance, in the G30, it already has 231 horsepower, while in the F-Series versions I mentioned, like the 125, 225, 325, and 425D, it had 224 horsepower. On the N47, these engines had 218 horsepower, for example, on the 325D, but on the B47, they added about 6 horsepower, making it 224. Now, the third main modification came around 2017-2018. This was a heavily reworked engine with few parts in common with the first version of the B47. The main difference here is the 2-stage turbocharging system, meaning it has 2 turbos, even on versions like the 320D and 520. So we see twin turbos even on engines with 190 horsepower. These engine versions were specifically installed in the G20 and 6 Series. There were no other versions available. These twin turbo versions were also installed in the G30 and the G02 after around the second half of 2018. However, There's information that the first versions of the B47 engine were still being installed in 2020 and 2021 models, like the G30 facelift, but I haven't personally seen such examples. Now let's start by talking about the first and most popular version of the B47 on the market. Here we have a G30 520D from 2017. In that year, it featured the first version of the B47 engine. These engines were available in the 18D versions, such as the 318D on the F30 with 150 horsepower. There was also a 316D version with around 120 horsepower, but honestly nobody cares about those, and you can hardly find them around here. For those who watched our previous videos about B-series engines, like the B58 or the B48, you probably understand the big leap that happened in terms of the engine systems compared to the earlier N-series engines, like the N20 and N55. And you might be expecting that finally there's a diesel in the B-series, which we haven't covered yet. And you may be thinking there will be a bunch of innovations from BMW that will significantly change the engine's characteristics. Well, I spent a few hours going through catalogs today, and I'll tell you that the difference here is nowhere near as significant as it was with the gasoline engines. Before going through our traditional checklist of engine systems, let me just say that I found a ton of identical parts between the B47 and the N47. First of all, when you remove the decorative cover and take a look at the engine, if you place it next to an N47, you'd probably say, damn, there's almost no difference here. The valve cover looks similar, the layout is very similar, and the intake system is quite similar too. So there's still a lot in common with the N47. For someone inexperienced, it's hard to tell the difference right away when they open the hood. Let's start, as usual, with the engine components. I've got a list here, and there are quite a few identical parts. For example, the engine still has similar aluminum block with cast iron sleeves, just like in its predecessor. This is a reliable and solid construction. I took a deep dive into the engine block and looked up the part numbers, and I found something surprising. The connecting rods are the same as in the N47. The crankshaft and pistons are different, but the connecting rods are identical. This already hints at a family resemblance. Moving on, the balance shafts are also the same. These are used to reduce engine vibrations, especially in diesels, and here they share the same part number as the ones in the N47, which is pretty cool. Now, about the timing chains. Everyone knows that in the N47, the timing chains need to be replaced after about 200,000 kilometers, but for some people, especially if the mileage has been tampered with, they can break as early as 100,000 or 130,000 kilometers. So, what's the deal with the chains on the B47? People are curious, right? Well, here's the answer. The chain setup is almost identical to the N47. I even checked the part numbers, and the upper chain is exactly the same. Imagine that. The upper chain has the same part number. There are 3 chains in total, one from the camshaft to the fuel pump, one from the fuel pump to the crankshaft, and one from the crankshaft to the oil pump. The upper right guide rail is also the same as the one in the N47. The chain tensioner is identical. The lower chain tensioner, which is a bolt tensioner, is hydraulic mechanical with a spring and oil pressure, and it's also the same. The lower right tensioner is identical, and so is the left one. There are 2 tensioners on the middle chain, and they are the same too. The chain itself, however, is different in the middle. The part number is different. The 2 chain guides on the middle chain are identical though. You can call them guides, sliders, or whatever you prefer. Additionally, the oil spray nozzle that lubricates the chain is the same. The lower third chain has the same part number as well. So in the timing mechanism, about 60% of the parts are the same as in the N47. My conclusion about the chains is that we shouldn't expect a significantly different lifespan here. Based on the information I found, I don't believe there are any special mechanisms that would extend or reduce the chain's lifespan. So, as with the N47, I'd still recommend replacing the timing chain after 200,000 kilometers on the B47. Now that we've covered the big question about chains, let's move on to other engine parts. There's also the torsional vibration damper, which is a common part on diesels, especially in the N47, where it was known to fail frequently. The B47 is no exception when it comes to issues like torsional vibration dampers. After about 100,000 kilometers, you might already start seeing cracks, so it's something to keep an eye on. Typically, they need to be replaced around 150,000 kilometers, but of course, this depends on your driving. As you can imagine, it's one thing to drive 150 kilometers in an hour in Germany, and quite another to drive 150 kilometers over a week in Kyiv. The engine's operating hours are different in each case. As for the internal components, I found some more identical parts. Both camshafts, intake, and exhaust are the same as in the N47. The rockers, hydraulic lifters, valve stem seals, and valves are also the same. Additionally, the cylinder head bolts are identical, as are the rear crankshaft seals and the incremental wheel that reads the crankshaft position for the sensor. But that's probably not as interesting for you. The valve cover looks very similar, although the oil filler cap is in a different place. The crankcase ventilation valve, CCV, is also in the same spot as it was in the N47. Even the injector mountings are the same. Those indentations in the valve cover are identical to the ones in the N47. The valve cover gasket looks exactly the same too. I checked the part numbers and photos, and it really seems identical, although technically the part numbers are different. I'd love to compare them physically, but for now, they seem the same. So that's everything I found regarding the engine components. It turns out that the B-Series diesel isn't all that new after all. Maybe BMW got tired of constantly modifying the N47 and decided to make a more revolutionary marketing move while reusing many of the same parts from the N47. From this, we can conclude that we're unlikely to see major changes as we move further through our checklist. Regarding the durability of gaskets and seals, as you probably know, things are generally better in diesels than in gasoline engines, since diesels are less heat-stressed. The same recommendations apply here as with the N47. Check the gaskets and seals after 170,000 kilometers, and possibly replace them around 200,000 kilometers. Before we move on to the next part of our engine checklist, I highly recommend you watch our previous video about the N47. It will greatly expand your knowledge and help you better understand what's going on here, since we'll be referencing it a lot. Now, about the intake system, it's almost identical to what was in the N47. There are no new liquid intercoolers like in the B48 2-liter gasoline engine, for example. Here, everything is straightforward and simple, just like in the N47, the same setup, a single turbo with an electronic wastegate. We're specifically talking about this version of the B47, which has one turbo. The intake system is the same. Pipes, boost pipe, intercooler, charge pipe, and then into the intake manifold. There are also swirl flaps on the intake side. As for the turbo, it's reliable and can last 200,000, 300,000 kilometers, but you'd need to find a well-maintained example with 300,000 kilometers to see how much it will last. Regarding oil leaks, it's likely the same scenario. If the turbo or crankcase ventilation CCV system starts leaking oil, you'll see oil droplets collecting at the boost pipe connections to the intercooler. This is a typical story. In such cases, you either replace the seals or check the CCV membrane in the valve cover. If that membrane is damaged, it could be a sign that your engine is in serious trouble. The intake system has the same issues as in the N47, but here the impact of the EGR exhaust gas recirculation system is more pronounced. The EGR valve on the B47 tends to fail sooner than on the N47, sometimes as early as 30,000, 50,000, or 60,000 kilometers. It clogs quickly, jams, and eventually breaks down. If the EGR valve gets stuck in the open position, exhaust gases flow into the intake. As you know, the intake is connected to the exhaust system via the EGR valve, pipe, and cooler. When the EGR valve jams open, hot exhaust gases enter the intake, which can cause it to overheat. In extreme cases, this can even cause the plastic intake manifold to melt or develop holes and cracks. This is a real issue that has happened before, leading to the need for intake replacements. Breaking news right here for our YouTube subscribers. Just as we were editing the video on the B47, we ran into an actual case with a B47 engine here in Lviv. Stay tuned for all the details coming up in our video. This is our Lviv service station. So, what do we have here? It's our 2 series for those who might have forgotten. Stage 3, 240D. It's our drum, got the rims on, but still missing the lowered springs. That's coming soon in a new episode. Now let's see what else we've got. Here's an F31 facelift, B47 Engine 320D. What's interesting here? New headlights, no MPAC, just regular fog lights. It's a European diesel, no NBT Evo, navigation professional. And wow, it's got a sport steering wheel but without paddle shifters, no sport transmission either. In short, it's a regular European touring model. We've hit 200,000 kilometers, And now we've run into an issue with the EGR and intake manifold. The EGR valve got stuck, and this is a perfect example of when the intake manifold actually melted and became full of holes. This here is a used one, and there's already a brand new manifold installed on the car. Take a look at this piece. You can see how the plastic melted and the soot is poking out, spreading everywhere. Here we have another one, And here's the other side I just flipped over, like, here we go. Check it out. Yeah, it's pretty harsh. That's how the car loses boost, and then you're stuck replacing the entire intake manifold. So that this doesn't happen, we highly recommend checking your intake every 100,000 kilometers, or even earlier, depending on the fuel quality, and cleaning the EGR from soot to prevent such a situation with the intake manifold. Alternatively, you can disable it programmatically, like doing a chip tune for emissions, disabling the EGR so that the valve can no longer get clogged or get stuck in the open position, and then exhaust gases will never flow into the intake. I remember about 4 years ago, I personally replaced such an EGR valve on a B47 engine. It was an F25 X3 in the restyling version, and it had a low mileage. I was surprised how quickly it failed, like it died so fast. So that's the story. There's also a known issue with the EGR cooler on B47 and B57 engines. Apparently there's an EGR radiator through which exhaust gases and coolant flow. The coolant cools the exhaust gases to prevent them from melting the intake or affecting the mixture formation. It happens that the radiator itself starts leaking coolant through it, meaning somewhere the metal, in short, gets damaged and coolant starts leaking. Combined with soot and hot exhaust gases, this can start a fire or lead to bad consequences. That's why BMW has a recall campaign on this issue. So, BMW may replace this radiator on your car under warranty, or even if the warranty has expired. If you have such an engine, check the VIN code, contact your local dealer, and they might replace it for free. I know of real cases like this. As for the flaps, there's a similar situation with the N47 engine. The cylinder head channels look identical to the N47 and have similar flap channels. These flaps can get clogged. The issue is that B-series engines get clogged even more than N-series engines, and the N-series engines get more clogged compared to M-series engines, like the M47 or M57. That's why it's recommended to check the intake for soot buildup here. You can remove it, send it for ultrasonic cleaning, or wash it in some other way. In general, you need to regularly service and maintain it. There's an interesting feature of the B47 engine, specifically in this body type. It has 2 exhaust gas recirculation circuits through the EGR system into the intake. In the past, there was only one circuit where the exhaust gases passed from the exhaust manifold through the radiator to the intake, and as you understand, when you're pushing the engine hard, there's high pressure in the intake, like up to 2 bars of boost pressure. Exhaust gases find it hard to penetrate there. So BMW made a second circuit, the so-called low pressure circuit, to make it easier for the exhaust gases to pass through. This system is implemented with the help of a second additional pipe from the exhaust manifold that passes through a second radiator with a valve and goes further, but it doesn't go into the intake. Instead, it goes into the air supply before the turbo. So after the air filter, the pipe simply enters, and which in another mode delivers exhaust gases as low pressure EGR system. If your car suddenly starts accelerating sluggishly or its operation becomes uneven with inconsistent power delivery, meaning it doesn't run as smoothly as usual, this could be related to the opening of a stuck EGR valve, so it's recommended to check it regularly. A potential problem with this low pressure EGR circuit solution is that now the exhaust gases may not only foul up the intake manifold where they used to go directly, but now they end up right in front of the turbo. This means they could also clog the turbo impeller, the intercooler, and even the pipes leading to the intercooler. Over time, this should be monitored, especially on vehicles with higher mileage. Moving on to the fuel supply system. Everything is standard here. working well without issues. It all starts in the fuel tank, where there's a submersible pump that operates reliably, supplying fuel to the high-pressure fuel pump, HPFP. By the way, the HPFP is located in the same place as on the N47 engine and visually looks almost identical, except for a different part number. This is likely due to increased performance as the fuel system in the B47 engine has increased fuel pressure to 2500 bars, which helps improve fuel efficiency. Piezo injectors are used here, which open quickly and can perform multiple injections in one stroke of the piston. I also found an interesting similarity in the fuel system with the N47. They share the same fuel rail pressure sensor, which means the rail has the same pressure sensor and the same pressure regulator with the exact same part number, so they are interchangeable. This shows that the B47 hasn't strayed too far from the N47 in terms of design. There are no issues with the fuel system, so let's move on. Let's move on to the ignition system, which in the case of a diesel engine is the glow plug system. If you've watched our previous videos like on the N47, N57 or M47 engines, you know that previously replacing the glow plugs was often accompanied by replacing the glow plug control module. This was done as a preventive measure to ensure the glow plug could even be unscrewed, as there's a risk that if it gets stuck, you might break the plug. This could lead to an expensive procedure to drill it out of the cylinder head, plus additional risks like half of the plug falling inside. So it's recommended to remove and check the glow plugs every 100,000 to 150,000 kilometers to prevent them from seizing. Some customers even replace them before winter, especially when there are glow plug error codes. Here's the thing. On the B47 engine, the glow plug control module's functionality has been integrated into the main DDE, Digital Diesel Electronics Control Unit, which manages the entire engine. The control logic, including the power transistors that heat the glow plugs, is now built into the engine control unit itself, so that's one less part to worry about. Hopefully, this means you won't have to replace the entire engine control unit if something goes wrong. The positioning of the glow plugs is identical to that on the N47 engine. Moving on to the engine cooling system, it's mostly the same as on the N47, except for the additional circuit that goes through the extra radiator for the low-pressure EGR system. You understand that to fit this extra radiator near the exhaust manifold, coolant must be routed there as well. But the difference is minor, and there usually aren't any issues. Unlike in gasoline engines, there's no electric water pump here, but rather a mechanical one. A nice improvement in the B47 engine is that, unlike on the N47, where there was a plastic flange protruding from the cylinder head under the intake, which often cracked and leaked, requiring intake removal to replace, this flange is no longer part of the cylinder head. Now it's located lower on the engine block itself, and we hope this is more reliable than the old setup. Also, a reminder about the coolant system. The standard type of caps on the expansion tanks should be replaced every 2 to 3 years, or every 2 years for gasoline engines. If your engine starts losing coolant, say a liter a month or even a liter a week, the first place to check is the EGR radiators, as there are 2 of them. It's advisable to temporarily block off the coolant supply to these radiators to test them or simply replace them, especially if your car is part of a recall campaign. If the recall doesn't apply to your car, you'll have to either replace or block off the radiators, which is how this issue is typically resolved. To avoid unnecessary expenses, it's best to test it first by blocking the system. Moving on to the auxiliary equipment, everything is standard here. Air conditioning compressor, alternator, electric power steering, no hydraulic power steering, 1 belt for the alternator and accessories. Rollers and belts should be replaced for preventive maintenance at around 100,000 plus kilometers. So far, there haven't been any major issues with the alternator or air conditioning compressor. Next is the exhaust system. As I mentioned earlier regarding the intake system, this also applies to the exhaust system, as there's an additional output for the low-pressure EGR system. Also, the B47 in certain models now meets Euro 6 emission standards, so it has the AdBlue system, which was previously mandatory on American versions with M57, N57, and N47 engines, but has now made its way into European B-series engines as well. By the way, diesel engines are not sold in America by default, so don't expect to find G-series diesel models, like the G20 or G30 over there. The AdBlue system injects urea into additional catalytic converters, where a chemical reaction with the exhaust gases occurs, significantly cleaning the emissions. Interestingly, in the E70 through E15 models, the AdBlue filling port was located under the hood, but now on the G30, it's placed next to the fuel filler cap. Now onto the chip tuning section. The stock B47 engine delivers 190 horsepower, but with a stage 1 tune, you can achieve around 220, 230 horsepower. Plus, you can disable the environmental systems, like turning off the 2 EGR valves, ensuring they never activate. This helps prevent issues with a dirty, clogged, or overheated intake system. After disabling the EGR system, it's recommended to also remove and delete the DPF, diesel particulate filter, as the regeneration cycle logic changes slightly without a functioning EGR, leading to fewer regeneration cycles. This could cause the DPF to clog up faster without the EGR system. Of course, if you're tired of the AdBlue system, you can disable that as well, though it's not as common of an issue on G-Series models as it is on American E70 or F15 models, where every third vehicle seems to have some AdBlue error or problem. That wraps up the discussion about the most popular B47 version, and now let's move on to the less common variant. This is the 2.5-liter version, seen on models like the 125, 225, 335, 435, and even on G30 models like the 525, as well as the 7 Series G11 and G12 with the 725D badge. Mechanically, this engine is very similar to the 2.0-liter version, but with 2 turbochargers. The main difference is the dual turbo setup and a more complex boost management system. For the driver, this twin turbo system means more power, 224 horsepower in the F Series and 231 horsepower in the G Series models. However, the downside is the increased complexity of the boost control system. While the single turbo setup was simple with just one electronic wastegate, this twin turbo setup involves 2 turbos, 2 vacuum actuators, vacuum lines, 2 pressure regulators, and an additional electric actuator for controlling the variable geometry of the turbo. So now you have 3 components, 2 vacuum actuators, and as you know from our previous videos, vacuum systems can degrade over time, usually after 10 years or 100,000, 200,000 kilometers. This may result in underboost or overboost issues. The first place to check would be the vacuum lines and pressure regulators. Similar to the twin-turbo N47 engine, you can comfortably achieve around 260, 280 horsepower with a stage 1 tune on the B47. Now moving on to the third type of the B47 engine. This is the newest version, the latest one, which, as I've noticed, has been in production since around mid-2018. For example, if you look at listings on Autoria, you'll see that models like the G30, G02, G01, X3, and X4 have been equipped with this type of B47 engine from around late 2018. This version is marked as B47D. If the first type was simply B47, this one is designated B47D. In my experience, this B47D is even more different from the original B47 than the B47 was from the N47. This version has a different engine block, a different crankshaft, though it retains the same connecting rod and different pistons. It still uses the same timing chains and tensioners, but the high-pressure fuel pump sprocket has been changed. One of the main differences is the location of the water pump. While in the earlier version it was mounted at the front, in the B47D it has been moved to the right, similar to the B48 gasoline engine. The pump also now includes a thermostat, and there's an additional main thermostat on the engine block. Essentially, everything has been redesigned. I found very few identical parts between the 2 versions. One example is the top timing chain sprocket on the camshaft. Both camshafts even seem to be carried over from the N47. The EGR valve, by the way, is the same, so it will still have the same issues. However, the EGR radiators are different, which gives hope that the problems seen in earlier versions won't reappear. These engine versions are installed, for example, on the G20 and the 6 Series models. That means on the G20 and 6 Series, only these latest versions are used. Additionally, starting from mid-2018, they were introduced on the G02 and G30 models. I checked Autoria, and all models from 2019 or 2020, like the 520, are already equipped with these new B47 versions. One key distinguishing feature is that these engines come standard with 2 turbochargers, and they're completely different from the previous twin-turbo versions. The principle is the same, but the construction is different. Imagine, for example, a 2020 520D with 190 HP using 2 turbochargers. Similarly, the G20 3018D with 150 HP also has 2 turbos. The power class remains the same, but with 2 turbos. It's intriguing to think about their peak boost performance and how they will behave in chip tuning. What is their power potential? Are they limited to 220, 230 HP in stock form, with chip tuning taking them to 280 HP? Or are they truly 190 HP stock but can reach 220, 230 HP with tuning? The twin-turbo system in this version differs in design from the previous B47, but the problems will be roughly the same because it still has 2 vacuum systems and 1 electronic actuator. To summarize briefly, the B47 was intended to be BMW's new 2-liter diesel engine, replacing the N47, but with improvements. What does better mean for BMW? It means more power and better fuel efficiency. As we can see from all these small enhancements, BMW has done a good job. For instance, the average fuel consumption of the B47 is about a liter less, so the B47 is essentially an improved N47, without some of the early issues like glow plug release or the coolant flange. Plus, it brings better fuel efficiency and more power, which should make owners happy. And ultimately, the B47 engine offers greater longevity, judging by the fact that some versions have reached 300,000 to 350,000 kilometers in Germany or are used in taxis. Plus, in the latest BMW G Series models, you won't find the N47 anymore, and there's no point in looking for it. This wasn't as drastic a transformation as when the M47 or M57 came out, where people thought the older engines were more reliable. Here, the situation is the opposite. The B Series, specifically the B47, is more reliable than the N47. So there's no need to fear BMW's new B Series diesel engines. Another benefit of the B47 is that it's quieter. BMW wrapped it in significant soundproofing, and owners who've had both the N47 and B47 engines have noted this improvement. This is yet another plus. So BMW's progress is clear. More power, better fuel economy, increased reliability, and quieter operation. All the key performance characteristics important to a BMW owner. Reliability has improved, except for the common issue with the EGR radiator. That's the kind of video we've put together for you, and I hope you enjoyed it. For all our efforts, give us likes, subscribe, and leave comments about what you'd like us to cover next, about which BMW engine. But don't ask about the B57 because we're about to release a video on that soon, and you'll be happy to see it. Don't forget there's a war in our country. Support the territorial defense forces, the armed forces of Ukraine, and the volunteers. Glory to Ukraine, death to the occupants, and we are getting back to work.